Hi, my name is Drew Malamud, and I'm a producer-engineer in Montreal. We're here at Studio Plateau, where I do most of my work. Studio Plateau is a facility that was created to help the independent music scene in Montreal. The philosophy was to put all of the money into the gear, to buy really high-end equipment, really good sounding stuff, not to have a receptionist and a stainless steel cappuccino machine. It's kind of a little bit ghetto in here, but it sounds amazing. And we charge very little to unsigned artists. We can rent the room for a fraction of what we would to a corporate client or a signed artist, and try to kind of help some of the independent bands in Montreal get demos made and records made and stuff like that. Some of the bands that have recorded Studio Plateau are Stars, Death from Above 1979, Metric, The Lovely Feathers, The Deers, to name a few. Well, I'm a producer-engineer, and I'm the one who physically gets the sounds by choosing the microphone, choosing the signal path for the microphone, what equalizer, compressor, things like that the signal will pass through. As a producer engineer, it depends on the project. Some bands have varying levels of willingness to stray from their initial concept of what they want their album to be. Some bands are very open to a producer, like, what do you think? What if we tried it like this? And depending on the project, depending on the band, you do more or less of that. But as an engineer, it's really the technical actually capturing the sounds in the best possible way. I think that the difference between an engineer and a producer varies from project to project. If you're working with a band who's brought in a producer because they like work that producer's done in the past, then the engineer is really more of just a facilitator towards the producer's intention. Whereas if you're engineering and there's no producer, the band's producing themselves, sometimes you'll have a lot more liberty to say, you know, wait a minute, I got an idea, why don't we try this? Tell me what you think this sounds like. But if there's a set producer doing that role, then he's going to be like, I want it to sound like this. And it's your job as the engineer to do whatever technically you have to do to achieve the producer's vision. So depending on the personnel of the project and the band's sort of the way they've decided they want to make their album, it can vary a lot. A lot of times on lower budget stuff, you're the producer and the engineer and everything all rolled up in one, and you're working together with the band. It's my favorite thing to produce or co-produce with the artists themselves. Obviously, you know, I don't like to take a band and change them too much. I love them to keep their own originality and their own sound, and I just try to make it better, maybe try some different instruments or different miking techniques, but still maintain the original intention of the artist. I think there's a big difference between doing front of house live sound and doing more studio engineering. Live sound, I kind of think of the difference between the two as recording in a studio is a lot like an operation in a hospital. All your tools are there. It's a very clean, controlled environment. If you need something, you can stop and get it. There's someone that can hand it to you. If you're doing live sound, it's kind of like camping. And you got a roll of duct tape and you got 2 seconds to make it work. Go. It's a lot of problem solving and making the best of your situation in a small amount of time. In the studio, you can, we'll get it tomorrow. In live sound, you have 2 seconds to get it right, and that's it. Sure, I was at Coachella with Metric. I was actually doing monitors, stage sound, which is really important to the band because you're mixing not for the audience, but for the sound on the stage so the artists can hear themselves. And you know, if the artist steps up to the mic and they can't hear their voice, they're not going to be able to have a good show, and it won't matter what's going on out there because they can't hear if they're in tune or not. live sound, I find, comes down to two main things: is confidence in your decision-making process and personal taste. You have to be like, this is how it should sound, and know that you're right, and not be like, does it sound okay? Do you think that's okay? Should I turn the, confidence in your decisions, knowing that you've got it exactly the way you want it to be, and just your personal taste, because a lot of mixers out there like to play it really safe, and they don't really put their heart into it, and they'll just keep it at it's really balanced, and it sounds all right, but they're not pushing forward. They're not, artists take risks, and musicians pour their heart out, and I find sometimes they're mixed in a really safe manner, and it doesn't, their message isn't getting across the same way as if the person mixing it really believes in it and is taking some risks themselves and pushing things maybe beyond the way they've ever done it before. That's when I find you really get the best live sound, is when the sound engineer is really in tune with the band and willing to take risks themselves. Well, there's always been great music in Montreal, and there's always been a really strong, tight music community, but it's only recently that the rest of the world's kind of been paying attention to it. I think that, Montreal is just a great place to be an artist. It's relatively cheap to live here. Unlike Manhattan or, LA, you don't have to work crazy hours just to be able to afford an apartment. You can find a cheap apartment, work a few days a week, and have a lot of time to create art, whether it's music or, graphic design or screen printing or anything. I feel like in Montreal there's a lot of support for the arts, no matter what it is. If any day of the week you can go out and see a show, you could see a reggae show or an electronic, drum and bass show, or an indie rock show. There's just so many people that are willing to support the arts, almost whatever it is. And a lot of the people in this community are artists, and they like to support each other. A lot of photographers put on shows, and a lot of musicians come to those. People maybe who've had their pictures taken by the photographer, and when that band plays, a lot of, everyone comes to each other's shows, no matter what, particular discipline of art it is. There's a lot of support, and I think maybe that's something that's unique to Montreal.
Mm-hmm. And how long have you lived here?
I've lived in Montreal 10 years now, and it's, I've lived all over Canada, and I really feel like Montreal is the best place to live, especially if you're interested in music and art, and really has a lot to offer. I think that there's a big kind of misconception that you have to be able to speak French to live here. I have been here 10 years, and I don't really speak French. I'm not proud of that. I should by now, but if you can get your taxi cab, street sign, and restaurant French down, you can survive. A lot of bands that are known as Montreal bands aren't actually from Montreal. They've just all moved here to create music together. Bands like Arcade Fire and Wolf Parade, very few of them are from Montreal. They've just been living here for a while. The Deers are an exception. They're Montrealers, true and true from day one. Most bands aren't, though. Most bands are originally from Toronto, originally from Victoria, and they've all moved to Montreal because it's a great place to live and play music. Is there room for other people? I think so. I think that there's always room for other people. There's always going to be new bands, and there's always going to be bands that are too big to play the smaller clubs, and new bands that come and fill their place. I think that there's definitely room for more musicians and more artists of all kinds here. Yeah, miking an amp is very different from miking drums. I find that dynamic microphone right on the speaker is a great way to start. You can use a condenser or a ribbon microphone on guitars also. They sound great, but I would like to use them more in conjunction with a dynamic microphone. It's kind of like a bit of a parachute or a net. You know, if you put a 57 in front of your guitar, it's going to sound exactly like the sound coming out, whereas a ribbon mic might be a little too dark or a condenser might be too punchy. You can put all three up, and as long as you have your dynamic, you know at the end of the day you're going to get what you want. Another thing you have to be careful about when using multiple mics on a single source is phase relationship. Mics can be out of phase with each other and cancel some sounds, and so oftentimes you have to place mics not where they sound best individually, but where they sound best in conjunction with the other mics. There's a recent tool that's now available to engineers made by a company called Little Labs. It's called the in-between phase tool, the IBP, and it allows you to place mics individually where they sound best individually and deal with phase relationship afterwards, because on a preamp, if you're lucky, you have a phase button and you can flip between 90 regular phase or 180 degrees out of phase. And that's all there's been until recently. With this device, you can sweep everywhere in between to find the exact perfect phase relationship between mics. So I find that the Little Labs in between phase tool helps me a lot. Well, it's one of the harder things to get right, because you're working with, when you're recording a guitar or a voice, it's usually one source and one or two microphones. When you're recording drums, you're dealing with, a lot of different individual sounds, and, typically when I record drums, I use between 10 and 14 microphones just on the drum kit. So you're dealing with a lot of complex relationships between the mics, phase relationships, and it's one of the more challenging things. It's one of the things I kind of feel I'm best at, is recording drums. I really enjoy the challenge of getting a unique drum sound different from any other recording I had done before, and really using the room to achieve certain sounds, certain quality of sounds. I think that being able to hear the difference between the different sounds is something that's learnable. I think a lot of it comes down to personal taste in any art. If you're good at what you do and people agree with your taste, then people are going to think you're great at your job. Some people record drums very dry and very closed. I'm more of a fan of using the room and putting mics very far away from the drums and trying to get more vintage, kind of roomy drum sounds. But in order to do that, you need a room with 14, 15 plus foot ceilings, and a lot of people record drums in their bedroom or in their basement and don't have high ceilings in a large room to do it in. So, obviously the environment you're in affects it a lot. Mm-hmm. So when I mic a drum kit, I use a combination of dynamic, condenser, and ribbon microphones. Over here we have the dynamics. The SM57 is the most common one that most people probably already have. This is the RE20, which is really nice for toms and kick drum. SM57 is great for snare or toms, depending. This is a Beta 52, which is really nice on kick drum. You can see it's got a large diaphragm, so it can pick up lower frequencies than the 57, which has a smaller diaphragm. These are condenser mics. These are the Neumann KM184s, which are great overheads over a drummer. Really nice and bright sounding. They also sound great on acoustic guitars. This is a U87, which is really good on just about anything. And this is a ribbon mic, a Coles 4038, which I really choose either between one of these or these for my overhead mics, depending on the drummer and how hard he hits the cymbals and what kind of style of drum sound the artist is looking for. So I'm going to take some time and show you guys how I might mic a drum kit, but keep in mind that it's only suggestion, and the number one rule is whatever sounds best wins. So miking a kick drum, oftentimes I like to take the outside skin right off. You don't have to, but I like to. I find it gives me more control. When miking a kick drum, oftentimes I'll use two microphones. I place one of them kind of inside closer to the beater, and this mic would be to get more attack, sort of the click of the kick drum, and then I'd use another one further back to get more of the oomph and the low end kind of rumble. But you got to be very careful about the distance between the two mics. A good rule of thumb is however long the drum shell is, should be the distance between your two microphones because of the size of the wave that the drum will create. You want to keep those two mics relative to each other so that they'll be in phase. So we're moving on to the snare drum. There's no real rule of how to mic a snare. Some people like to have the mic pointed up at an angle. Some people like to have it more vertical, more horizontal alongside the drum. It will give you a very different sound depending on how up or down you are. So just experiment and try and see what you like. One of the things you can do is to minimize the amount of hi-hat bleed into your snare, I try to point the snare mic so that the hi-hat is directly behind it, because that's where the most cancellation is, the most rejection from the mic. So if you don't want a lot of hi-hat in your snare, you should try to have the hi-hat directly behind the snare mic. Another important thing when you're miking either a snare or a tom is not to put the mic too close. If you put a mic really, really close, some people might say that that's choked, because when you hear a drum, your ear isn't right next to it. So I like to put my mic a little further away, sort of a more natural, open sound to the drum. And again, on the floor tom, I'd put it probably somewhere like that. A lot of people, would put it rather close, and I find putting it kind of further away can give you a more open, natural sound. So moving on, we do overheads. Overheads, I was saying sometimes I like to use ribbons, sometimes I like to use condensers. Condensers, like the Neumann KM184, are placed, approximately like this, will give you a really bright, really nice cymbal sound. One technique of drum miking is to first get the sounds of your overheads. Try to get the entire drum kit, toms, kick, snare, everything going in these. And that way all you need to do is just bring up a little bit of the other ones just to taste. Really, if you have your entire drum sound in your overheads, then you can't really lose. I personally like to record drums in a room with as little other noise as possible, mostly so that I can do some heavy compression techniques on room mics and stuff. And if you have other people in the room, that's just going to get bleed into everything. I usually, at the very minimum, put the bass player in the room so he can make eye contact with the drummer and they can look at each other and feel the vibe when they're playing with each other. But oftentimes I'll do that with the bass player plugged in direct, so there's no actual sound in the room. The only sound in the room is the drums itself. That allows for the most control as an engineer. But sometimes bands like to all be together in a room playing and you record just live off the floor, and that's really cool too. You just have kind of less options and less control. So once we plug the mic in to the drum set, it goes into a snake, and the snake comes up in this room, and each mic has its own preamp. Now I have two kinds of preamps, some that are very colored, which change the sound, and some which are very transparent, which leave it alone. So you decide which preamp you want for which mic, and then after the preamp, it would then go into an EQ, where you could adjust the levels of different frequencies, treble and bass. And from an EQ, you could then go into a compressor to affect the dynamic range of a signal. If something's like a snare drum is really quiet and then crazy loud, a compressor can help control the dynamics of a signal so that you have a more normalized signal going to your computer as opposed to just something that's crazy loud every once in a while. So we go preamp, EQ, compressor, and the next step in the chain is over here, which is the converter. These are both converters here, and converters, much like preamps, have sound to them too, and different converters have different sounds. This is the DigiDesign converter that basically comes with Pro Tools, and this is an outboard apogee converter that's more of an aftermarket one that has a nicer sound in my opinion. And this is the unit that actually converts your analog information into digital, and at that point it gets stored on your hard drive. So this is Pro Tools, and each one of our mics is going to come up on a channel of Pro Tools, and we can listen to them individually. Like this is just our kick drum. And here's just a snare drum. Here's just some toms. And here's the overheads, which pretty much contain everything. You know you've got your drum recording right if you can just listen to overheads and hear everything in a balanced manner. And here's some what a room mic would sound like. This is a heavily compressed room mic. Adding that into your individual close mics adds sort of a little bit of excitement to it. Makes the drum sound a little more energetic, I find. To me, engineering is about taking risks and experimentation. In my mind, the only rule when recording is whatever sounds best wins. And there's a few different types of microphones I use when I record. The first is a dynamic microphone that people know, like the Shure 57 or 58. It's often used live. You can hold it in your hand, unlike some microphones. And what I mean by a dynamic microphone is exactly what you put in is exactly what comes out. There's no real change of it. If you scream this loud, it's going to be that loud coming out. Whereas a condenser microphone, like this guy over here, this is the Neumann U87. It's a very famous mic. People used it on John Coltrane's saxophone, and Elvis sang into it. All kinds of people use this for all kinds of things. It's a condenser microphone, so it's a lot different than a dynamic microphone because it changes the sound. It kind of compresses the distance, like a telephoto lens compresses the distance between foreground and background. A condenser mic kind of takes things from very far away or close and makes them more the same. It's great on vocals, horns, over a drummer to get cymbals. It's great for all kinds of things. And one of my favorite microphones is the ribbon microphone. This is a Coles 4038, and it was made famous. They used it a lot on the Beatles albums as a drum overhead on Ringo Starr. It does something to cymbals that no other mic does. It is inherently darker. It doesn't pick up frequencies higher up in the spectrum, and it kind of makes your cymbals sound more like sugar, less harsh and more sweet and round. The one thing about it is you can't make any air on a ribbon microphone. If you were to blow in it or sneeze on it, it would be ruined. So it's very delicate. I think that you have to have a ribbon to sound like a ribbon, and you have to have a condenser to sound like a condenser. They make a lot of plugins that do magical things, but they don't have one that makes a dynamic sound like a condenser or a condenser sound like a ribbon. That's something, you have to have the actual mic to achieve that particular sound. Choosing the mic, yeah, is an important thing. This goes back to one of my rules: whatever sounds best wins. So people might teach you, or it might say in a book, you have to use a dynamic microphone. You can't use a condenser on a kick drum. Or really, try it out and see what you think. Is my advice, because some of the coolest sounds I've ever gotten were because I used something that you weren't supposed to on something that you should never do.
And is there another element of placement?
Placement is really important. It's real easy to just put a mic somewhere and then adjust the treble and bass to make it the way you want. But before you even reach for treble and bass and adjustments, you can do a lot of the same thing just by moving the microphone around. So I do think that placement is really important, and you can spend a lot of time just moving a matter of inches or millimeters, and can make a huge difference on the tonality of a drum or a guitar, speaker, anything really. So there's choice of mic, there's placement, and another important element is your choice of preamp, which is more of a luxury, because people recording in their bedroom are going to have the microphone, the preamp that's built into their little Pro Tools or built into their little mixer. In a studio, you often have many different kinds of preamps, and each preamp has its own coloration. Or lack of coloration. Sometimes you choose a microphone because it's completely transparent and doesn't color the sound at all. A lot of my favorite preamps are very colored and change the sound a lot, like a Neve or an API preamp, as opposed to a Grace or a Millennia, which are very transparent, because that can change the sound a lot. And before you even have to reach for a bass adjustment, maybe this preamp is more bassy. So that's one of the ways to do it. Traditional recording education says that you should record everything with no EQ and no compression, completely dry, and then only take steps to do those things in the mix. That's very safe. I really like to EQ and compress beforehand, because that way when I'm done, I don't have to put any plugins, or I don't have to really do anything to it. It's almost already there. You just pull the faders up and it sounds the way I want to, rather than having to go in and really adjust it and fix this and compress that. I like to do it beforehand, but it's risky because you have to get it right, because once you do it, it's done and there's no going back. That's why they teach you not to do it. But if you can get it right, I find it's better to do it if you're recording digitally, especially, because if you go through an analog EQ and an analog compressor before it even hits the computer, your sound is the way you want it to be without having to go in and start using plugins to do digital processing. Well, my advice to someone who's just starting out would be really to figure it out what it is you want to do and make it happen for yourself. Don't really depend on, oh, well, maybe this friend of mine knows someone and they might be able to, you have to go out and really actively make things happen for yourself, I find. And one of the best ways to learn how to do something is just to go do it, even if you haven't done it before, and you'll learn from your mistakes and you'll be better next time. And I think, although I studied engineering to some degree in university, I really started learning once I got out of school and just started doing things for real. And I think that's one of the best ways to learn.